Welcome, everyone, to our Writers Chat. Today, we're going to be discussing that sweet child of mine, how to handle rejections. And I'd like to welcome Dr. Kevin Eva, who is going to share his thoughts, perspectives, and insights with us around handling rejections. Dr. Eva is the Associate Director and Senior Scientist in the Center for Health Education Scholarship and a Professor and Director of Educational Research and Scholarship in the Department of Medicine at the University of British Columbia. He has a number of international appointments, such as visiting professor at the University of Bern in Switzerland, an honorary professional fellow at the University of Melbourne in Australia, and an honorary school professor of health science education at the Aarhus University in Denmark, and researcher at the University of Maastricht in the Netherlands. So he should fit right in today with our international group for our Writers Chat. And we welcome you, Dr. Eva, to share with us your insights and thoughts around handling rejections.
Thanks very much, Alana, Teresa, and everyone else. Please call me Kevin. This should not be a formal session. I will very happily engage with any discussions that you want to have about this very topic, and I'm going to try very hard to not take offense that Teresa and Alana knew that it was me you should speak with about being rejected. So it is definitely something that we will all deal with, hopefully many times over the course of our careers. So I do definitely have a lot of experience with not rejections, with the process of being rejected, I should say, and trying to go through the struggle of deciding how are you going to address these very challenging revisions that or comments that the reviewers have put towards you. Just as a really quick aside, I mentioned that email, the song that was played at the beginning of this, Sweet Child of Mine. Fantastic title for the song. I love the creativity that you've labeled each of these sessions after particular songs. Anyway, so again, I want this to just be an informal discussion. I'm very happy to address any queries or uncertainties you have about the revision stage. I did jot down a few thoughts to kick things off, and wound up coming up with a list of 8 things that I would strongly encourage you to do, and 2 things that I would strongly encourage you to avoid. So I'll go through those in roughly chronological sequence in terms of how to approach this activity. Like everything in writing, though, I am certainly of the opinion that there's no one right way to do these things. So you're going to have to find the techniques that work well for you, but I'll share the things that I think have served me well over the course of the years. And the very first thing, and maybe the most important thing I want to say when you're sent a letter that invites you to revise an article is that you need to take the time to celebrate. That is the best letter you're ever going to receive from an editor in response to your first submission. You should keep in mind that as soon as the editor says, we will publish this manuscript, it's effectively a legally binding contract. And so the best response you will receive is, we can't publish this in its current form. However, if you're able to address these issues, we will reconsider it. No editor should encourage you to go through the work of revisions unless they think it will be published. It's certainly not guaranteed, so you need to take the time to put the effort in and make sure that you address the reviewer's comments. But take that as a very good sign that if you put that effort in, it'll have a good outcome. The second thing I would encourage, and again, perhaps after the champagne headache has worn off, is to read the review through, and literally just read it. Don't stew over the details too much. Just read it top to bottom, and then walk away from it for a couple of weeks, ideally. It is unbelievable how consistently I have found that when I come back to reviews after that initial emotional reaction has passed, whether it's the positive reaction or the negative reaction, based on the content of the reviews, you just see them differently. And things that at first glance often seem like they'll be a real challenge to address sometimes become clear once you've let those emotions subside. And so you obviously don't want to leave it too long, because the editor's expecting a reply, and just knowing full well that you'll have other things you need to do. You certainly don't want things like this hanging over your head for a long time. But take the time to just let your unconscious mull over the reviews for a little while, and then come back to them. At a very practical level, when you do come back to them, the third thing I would recommend is that you start by simply copying and pasting those reviews into a Word file. And what I find helpful is that not only starts the response letter that you're going to need to write to explain to editors how you've addressed the comments, but I read through it once it's in a Word file and highlight the substantive bits, the phrases that indicate what are the things that you need to address. So sort of reading through all the prose that surrounds the key issue of what is the editor or the reviewer expecting in response to their comments. The reason I find it useful is, again, sometimes these reviews are 4, 5, 6 pages by the time you put them all together. And so going through and pulling out those essential bits helps keep you focused and creates a bit of a checklist for you as you're going through your revisions, where you can unhighlight things as they've been addressed, and therefore give yourself a sense of how much more work there remains to be done. The fourth thing is pay particular attention to the editor's commentary. If the editor is doing their job well, they should summarize for you what they think to be the key issues. The editor will not necessarily agree with everything that the reviewers have said, but they likely don't have time to go through and point by point say, please address this, don't worry about that, please address this. And as you will encounter, if you haven't already, the reviewers themselves don't always agree with each other. So sometimes it can be a bit difficult to decide what you should prioritize. I've had authors previously say, we addressed all the reviewers' comments, but didn't address your comments because we didn't think that was part of the review. That is exactly the opposite of the way that you should approach these review letters that you receive. It's the editor typically who will make the final decision. And so if they've highlighted key points or summarized what they think the issue to be, that should be treated as the main criterion on which the eventual decision is going to ride. So be particularly thoughtful about what the editor is offering. The fifth thing, again, just very practical, turn on track changes on your document. And I'd suggest just starting with the easy things first. Get things flowing by dealing with those easy wins, typographical errors, sentence construction issues, those things that are reflected in isolated or isolatable components of the manuscript. Just are a great way of starting to lessen the number of things on your to-do list, and can make it feel like you're making progress in a way that refamiliarizes yourself as well with the manuscript. Because typically we get reviews 2 to 3 months after the paper's been submitted, and it's a bit of effort just to go back and remember what you wrote. So that's one way of leading you through the manuscript so that you can start to put the reviewer's comments in better context. Once you've done that, then I would strongly encourage you to approach the revision process by working through the paper from top to bottom. Oftentimes, reviewers write their review in a way that focuses on the introduction and then the methods and then the results and the discussion. But the spirit of what they're saying might actually be reflected in multiple places in the manuscript. And so rather than atomizing your paper and trying to deal with one sentence or one paragraph at a time, I think it's really important that you spend the time to think about what is the reviewer trying to tell me here at root about what they struggled with in the paper, and think about that as you work through the entirety of the manuscript, rather than trusting that if you change one or two sentences, that's necessarily going to be sufficient to really meet the spirit of the feedback that you're receiving. And the other reason to do that is it's very easy when you start atomizing the manuscript into pieces to forget that you've said something, and to start saying things redundantly, or to say things that are incohesive across the different parts of the manuscript. So you treat the manuscript as a whole rather than as a collection of parts. You clearly need to consult with your co-authors along the way, whether you do that upon first receiving the review and strategizing a plan, or after taking a shot at collecting your thoughts by making the actual revisions, is highly variable. Often has to do with the different roles that the team members are playing. Often has to do with individual writing styles. I know for me, it's often hard for me to put into words what I think the best reaction or response to a review will be until I've tried to actually write it. So if you're someone like that who finds it easier to generate thoughts by writing, then you might find it easier to take a first crack at reviewing before sharing with your co-authors. If there's something that you're just truly stuck on or uncertain about, then I'd advise you to check in with your co-authors and try to create a strategy before you waste time going off in a direction that your co-authors might not find terribly appealing. And the eighth and final thing to do that I'll say just off the top is once you believe that you've got the final package, you've got everything written the way that you want it, then read it again from top to bottom. Again, that final proofread stage to just make sure that you've addressed everything, and that the paper remains in your voice, that it's addressing the reviewer's comments, but it still is something that you're proud to have your name assigned to, and you haven't just sort of thrown away what you think to be the most important points or the most compelling arguments in an effort to try to keep the reviewers happy. At the end of the day, it's still your work, and the editor should be trying to enable you to present it in your voice rather than rewriting the work for you. Also, do another full read of the response letter I alluded to earlier, which of course is that verbatim copy and paste of the reviews with your annotations built in about how you addressed each and every reviewer's comments, and where in the manuscript the editor can find that information. Because the easier you make their job of understanding how you've addressed the issues, the more likely they are to be in the right frame of mind when they're offering the judgment on whether or not they have been addressed. So you don't need to address every single comment, but because there are things that you should genuinely disagree with. But in the response letter, you should definitely explain why you've chosen not to address a particular comment, rather than simply ignoring it and trusting that it won't matter in the final decision. That, though, leads me to the first of my two things to avoid, which is defensiveness and aggression. There are going to be things that you should say. I think the manuscript would be made worse for changing in this way, but choose your battles in that regard fairly carefully. Right? If your response to every reviewer comment is "this reviewer's an idiot," we're not going to do that. You're not only approaching the review process from the wrong frame of mind, but you're probably going to put the editor in a position of saying they're not really taking this seriously, and that'll reduce the likelihood of success. Okay, it's worth keeping in mind that the reviewer might be wrong, despite the title of the editorial that was circulated in advance of the session. The reviewer might be wrong, but that doesn't mean that you're right. right? If they've misinterpreted something in your eyes, the onus remains on you to write it in a way that will reduce the chance of misinterpretation. And so take that seriously, and approach the revisions, even the wrong ones, from a spirit of how can I use this to make my work better? Because it's never, or at least shouldn't ever, be personal. The reviewers have invested their own time and effort to try to help you make your paper better. So treat it as a gift, even though it's not always something that you want to unwrap. The last thing I'll say, the second sort of thing to avoid is superficiality. We often get comments in our responses, things like, "We couldn't address this due to word constraints." That feels like a cop-out to me as an editor, because as an author, I know that you can almost always find ways to say things more concisely, and therefore to not go through that effort really feels like you've just decided that you're not going to, rather than that you can't. Certainly, if there is a journal that has hard and fast word limits, you might need to raise that issue, and you can engage in a dialogue with the editor about, is this sufficient priority to you that we should give up other important pieces of the manuscript, or would you accept even a few hundred extra words in order to enable us to address that comment? And the second common way in which we see superficiality is simply taking the reviewer's comments and listing them in the limitations section. If there are real methodological problems, you need to address why the reader should still trust the manuscript and try to learn something from it, rather than approaching it with the belief that as long as you said everything that's wrong with it, people should want to read it. Anyway, that's a lot of information in a short period of time. I'll stop there with sort of my prepared remarks. Happy to clarify anything and take the conversation in other directions if that'd be more useful.
Thanks, Kevin, so much for those tips. And even just thinking back from the first part of walking away and taking time to digest and let that emotion reside and settle down before you actually dive in to addressing any remarks, I think is really key. And I think we don't always take that time because we want to act on things right away. And I was just thinking about, and I think it was from a paper I had a long time ago, where sometimes you get a reviewer comment and there's multiple reviewers for that particular paper, but the reviewer comments contradict each other. And in the case that maybe the editor has not commented on that piece in their commentary, how do you deal with that as the writer?
Yeah, that's the classic phenomenon, right? It's always the conflict between reviewers that, especially reviewer two. Yeah, the meme, of course. As an editor, I have changed my opinion on that quite substantially, actually, over the years. And that, I like many of you, was very aware of the literature that casts doubt on peer review by virtue of saying it's unreliable. Different people give totally different reviews, and you get in these situations all the time of conflict. I've actually come to think that that's the benefit of peer review. If everybody gives the same answer, then it's probably a fairly straightforward, simplistic issue. It's the variety of impressions that people form that is really valuable to me when I'm trying to judge whether or not we should give a manuscript priority. And so I would encourage you to use those contradictions, as frustrating as they can be, as opportunities to think about what do I need to say to convince the person who's less convinced, without losing what the other individuals clearly thought was a strength. And sometimes the the positive reviewers' comments give you insights into how you could strengthen the argument in a way that might address the negative reviewers' comments. So the reflex that we all have is to say, reviewer one loved this, so I'm going to ignore reviewer two. Right? I would actually approach it the opposite way. Think carefully about what reviewer two had to say. Try to figure out, based on their comments, why they formed a different impression than the other reviewers did. And if you can alter the text in a way that maintains the strength that was observed while addressing the more critical person, it's worth that effort, because each of those reviewers is a reflection of the perspectives that some of the readers will form when they release the paper. So it's in my best interest to try to address the most negative comments and not simply trust that the people who are most positive are the right ones.
And that leads into another reflection I had when you were speaking about when you have a reviewer who may have misinterpreted something you've written. While they are one voice that's coming through in the review comments, they're probably representing a number of people who also might misinterpret. And so it gives you that prompt to think about, how might what I've written be taken by different readership, and really be reflective on what you're writing and the way it's coming across. And I wanted to probe a little bit more about what to do if there's something that you maybe can't change with the work. So one question came up in a prior session that we had, where they'd received some internal review around the methodology. And the study was already done, and they can't go back and change that. And you had touched on this a little bit about, if this came up in a review, not just putting it in the limitation section, which is one of the thoughts we had of how that could be addressed. Are there other ways in which you suggest that that could be addressed in the paper?
In those situations, sometimes when that comes up, it is a sign that you actually should just treat it as a learning experience. And maybe the paper won't see the light of day because you can't make a strong enough argument around why there's something to learn from it, despite that flaw. But presuming that you're continuing to try to write it up because you think that there is still something valuable in the work, despite recognizing that as a limitation, rather than hoping that the reviewers will miss it, my approach would be to acknowledge it front and center, maybe even in the method section, by saying an alternative or an ideal strategy would have been to do something else. We didn't do that for these reasons, and ideally, in making that argument, if you could flag up strengths or advantages of the way that you did do it, that may offset some of the disadvantages of the alternative strategy. The more you can position the reader to better understand that this might not be the ideal piece you're looking for, but it's still a valuable piece for these reasons, the more likely that they'll appreciate why you're bothering to put it out there. So if it's truly a fatal flaw, sometimes writing can't save it. But if it's something that you're convinced doesn't completely undermine the message, then explain that explicitly.
That's great. Thanks. I really like those insights and where you can sort of pepper that information throughout and not just leaving it to a limitation section. I'm going to open it up for any questions from our participants, and you can feel free to unmute yourself or put a message into the chat.
I have a question more from your perspective and the reviewers and the authors. I'm in the spirit of the reviewer is always right, even when they're wrong. Do you ever find need to edit the reviewer's comments or possibly even censor them sometimes before you send it out? And is that kind of a responsibility that many editors take on?
So that's one of those things I would imagine you might get a different answer from different editors. So I'll give you my perspective, but don't want to imply that it's necessarily universal. I feel a moral obligation to be as transparent as possible. And so even reviewers' comments that I disagree with, or that or maybe on the edge of not being constructive, we share those with people and accept that we're adding to authors' frustrations when they get reviews that aren't helpful for one reason or another. The one exception to that, and the only time that I censor reviews is when the person has said something that's clearly a professional lapse. They've made it personal. They've insulted the authors in some way, and in those cases, we try to delete the offending text and send an email back to the reviewers saying that's not okay. We value as a reviewer, but if you're going to review in that way, we'll have to exclude you from this point forward. But that's the other reason I say, it's important to keep in mind that in your response, there will be times when you need to say, we've read this and thought carefully about it, but don't think we should change the paper for these reasons, because you shouldn't assume that the editor necessarily agrees with every point that's been raised.
Thank you, Kevin. Eva has made a comment about great reviewers that she has worked with that have provided constructive and helpful feedback. But it looks from the comment that it's a little bit different than the typical review process for journals. And I'm wondering, Eva, if you wouldn't mind just sharing a little bit more on what you were talking about in the comments.
Hi, no, that's a misunderstanding. I didn't encounter that process. I just encountered the normal written feedback, the normal peer review, and I found it very helpful. And in some cases, some questions were left open, or I wasn't sure whether I understood them correctly. And I wondered if it was easier if I could just contact them and ask them, what do you mean? And if I go into that direction, is that what you mean? And the way the peer review is done with that, you can answer one time, and then some weeks later you receive the next answer, and it's so slow and difficult, I find it. And I wondered whether journals are discussing if you could speed it up and also have more interaction, because peer review could be such a great source of information.
Yeah, no, really, really important points and questions. And I think every journal tries to manage the process and be the mediator between the peer reviewers and the authors, partly out of protection for everybody, to make them feel like they can show their honest opinion without all of a sudden getting attacked by the authors who disagree with them, and partly because we need to keep track of what instruction or advice has been given to the authors to help inform the eventual decisions. And so if there's a lot of crosstalk going on behind the scenes, it can be very difficult to understand the basis for some of the revisions. So of course, nowadays we strongly encourage reviewers as much as they're willing to sign their reviews, and so there's no way we could prevent people from looking up those reviewers and contacting them directly. I just wouldn't advise it. If you need advice from the editor, though, about I could approach this one of two ways, and I'm really struggling to figure out which would be most productive. What do you think? Sending that sort of email to the editor, I would certainly hope would get a productive and generative response. The editors have limited capacity to do that because we get 3,600 papers last year, and so to engage in a proactive revisioning or writing process for every author just isn't possible. But if there's fairly straightforward questions that you've grappled with as a authorship group and still can't come to some resolution on, then certainly I'd be happy to share my perspective on what's most likely to be appealing with whatever revision is submitted. But again, along those lines, the other source of advice that I would strongly encourage you to use that may be more accessible is you've got peers around you, even if they're not part of the co-authorship team, right? This group is a group that I presume to be coming together because you're trying to get better at writing and trying to help one another get better at writing. So if your co-authors can't readily come to some consensus about how to alter the article, or even if they can, share it with people outside the authorship team and ask for an informal peer review. And in some cases, I've even given the reviews to a colleague and said, "Do you mind just taking a look at what we were told here and how we've addressed it, and offer your judgment as to whether I think it's adequate?" The more you can get that peer review support outside of the high stakes process of the journal making their decision, the better.
That's great. Thank you so much, Kevin, for taking the time this morning and answering the questions and sharing with us your insights and perspectives.